He told police in Inglewood he planned to kill them to prevent the family from becoming homeless after he lost his job. In the trial, though, evidence showed the family did have money. McLaren received 2 life sentences for the 2 murders.
Inside a quiet family apartment, 2 lives ended violently. There was no scream, no warning, no frantic call for help, just an axe, rising and falling, in the hands of the man they called husband and father. Police would later say the motive wasn't rage, it was fear. And that explanation would divide an entire community. This case forces us to confront a terrifying question. At what point does desperation become murder? What happened inside that apartment shocked even seasoned investigators. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why some people believe this crime was inevitable, while others believe it was unforgivable. Englewood Parkway didn't look like the kind of place where violence lived. Neatly kept buildings, soft evening lights, neighbors who nodded politely but mostly kept to themselves. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. And that's why what happened next was so unsettling. Because when police arrived on March 25th, 2023, there were no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no shattered windows, just silence. And 2 bodies inside. Ruth depended on routine. She was 35 years old, but life had never been simple for her. Cerebral palsy, epilepsy, daily challenges most people never think twice about. Her world worked best when it stayed predictable. And for decades, it had. Because her mother, Bethany, made sure of it. Bethany McLaren was 70 years old. A wife, a mother, a caregiver who had spent years putting someone else's needs before her own. She knew Ruth's medications by memory. She knew the signs before a seizure. She knew how to keep her daughter calm when the world felt overwhelming. This wasn't just a mother and daughter. This was a bond built on dependence, patience, and quiet love. And the man living with them? Reginald McLaren. Husband, father, protector. At least, that's how it was supposed to be. March 25th began like any other day. No reports of arguments. No neighbors hearing raised voices. No warning signs screaming that something was wrong. And that's what makes what happened next so difficult to understand. Because sometime inside that apartment, Reginald McLaren picked up an axe. Not a gun. Not a knife. An axe. Heavy, personal, intimate in the worst possible way. Police would later confirm both Bethany and Ruth died from chop wounds. Multiple blows. No evidence of a struggle. No indication that either woman had time to escape. The people who depended on him never saw it coming. When authorities entered the apartment, the scene told a chilling story. 2 women. 2 generations. Gone. The violence stood in stark contrast to the calm surroundings. This wasn't a crime of chaos. It was contained, controlled, and disturbingly quiet. Investigators immediately began asking the most obvious question. Why? Reginald didn't deny what he'd done. In fact, his explanation came quickly. Too quickly. He told police he had lost his job, that the bills were piling up, that he feared eviction, that he believed homelessness was inevitable. And in his mind, death was better than what he believed was coming. He claimed he killed them out of fear, out of desperation, out of what he thought was mercy. But police weren't convinced. Investigators began looking closer, because fear alone doesn't explain certain things. Why an axe? Why no attempt to seek help? Why not reach out to social services? Why not leave? Why not anything else? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, why did only Bethany and Ruth die? Reginald was still alive, still breathing, still able to face the consequences. That imbalance mattered. Word spread quickly. A mother, a disabled daughter, killed by the man meant to care for them. Vigils were held, candles flickered in the night. Strangers cried for people they had never met. The Colorado-Nepal Alliance stepped in to assist with burial arrangements. Because even in death, Bethany and Ruth were not abandoned. The community refused to let them disappear quietly. This case split people down the middle. Some asked, what if he truly believed there was no other way? Others asked, what kind of fear justifies murder? Was this a man crushed by circumstance? Or a man who chose violence when control slipped away? And the courtroom would soon have to decide. By the time the case went to trial, one thing was clear. The jury wasn't just judging Reginald McLaren. They were judging an idea. Does desperation excuse the unthinkable? Because once the evidence was laid out, once the prosecution revealed what they believed really happened, everything Reginald claimed began to unravel. And the truth was far more disturbing than fear alone. They said fear drove him. That's the word Reginald McLaren kept coming back to. Fear of losing everything. Fear of being evicted. Fear of watching his wife and disabled daughter suffer on the streets. But fear, on its own, doesn't leave behind patterns. And once investigators started pulling on the loose threads of his story, the fabric began to tear. Slowly at first, then all at once. Police didn't rush to conclusions. They rarely do. Scenes like this demand patience. You don't just look at what happened. You look at what didn't happen. There were no signs of a struggle. That detail alone haunted detectives. Because when someone is attacked unexpectedly, there's usually chaos, scratches, bruises, defensive wounds. Something. Anything. That suggests a fight for survival. But Bethany and Ruth had none of that, which raised a chilling possibility. They trusted the person who stood over them. The apartment itself was almost unsettling in how normal it looked. Furniture neatly arranged, nothing overturned, no broken lamps or shattered glass. If not for what lay inside, it could have been any other quiet family home. And then there was the weapon. An axe isn't subtle. It's heavy, awkward. It requires intent, strength, follow through. This wasn't something grabbed in a moment of blind panic. This was something used deliberately. Investigators asked themselves a question they've learned to ask over and over again in cases like this. Why this weapon, and why this way? Reginald told police he was overwhelmed, that he felt cornered, that he believed homelessness was imminent. But when detectives began verifying his claims, things didn't line up the way his story suggested they should. Yes, he had lost his job. That part was true. But losing a job doesn't instantly lead to eviction. There are processes, notices, grace periods, resources. And there was no eviction notice on the door. No final warning taped to the apartment. No paperwork suggesting they were days away from being thrown out. That didn't mean financial stress wasn't real. But it did mean the situation wasn't as immediate as Reginald made it sound. And then there was Ruth. Ruth depended on stability. Routine wasn't just comfort for her. It was safety. Any disruption could trigger confusion, distress, even seizures. Bethany knew this better than anyone, which made the idea that she would calmly accept death as a solution deeply unsettling. Investigators began to wonder whether Reginald's explanation wasn't just incomplete, but convenient. Fear is a word people understand. Fear sounds human. Fear sounds sympathetic. But fear doesn't explain why Reginald survived. It doesn't explain why there was no attempt to leave the apartment afterward. It doesn't explain why neighbors reported nothing unusual. And it certainly doesn't explain the silence, because no one heard a scream, no cry for help, no desperate plea, just a normal day that ended in bloodshed. As the case moved forward, prosecutors focused on one critical idea: choice. They argued that fear didn't force Reginald's hand. He wasn't facing an immediate threat. He wasn't acting in self-defense. He had options. Options that didn't involve killing a 70-year-old woman and her disabled daughter. And the jury would need to decide whether his explanation was the truth, or a story shaped to soften the horror of what he'd done. During the trial, the courtroom sat in heavy silence as details were laid out. Photos no one wanted to see. Testimony no one wanted to hear. Each piece of evidence stripped away another layer of Reginald's narrative. The prosecution emphasized the methodical nature of the crime. The defense leaned into desperation. They wanted the jury to see a man crushed by circumstances beyond his control. But the more the story unfolded, the harder it became to ignore one haunting reality. Desperation doesn't usually look this controlled. It doesn't usually leave one person alive. It doesn't usually come without a fight. And as witnesses took the stand, the emotional weight of the case grew heavier. Friends spoke of Bethany's devotion, of how her life revolved around Ruth's care, of the quiet sacrifices she made without complaint. People who knew Ruth talked about her gentleness, her reliance on those around her, her trust. Trust that in the end would be betrayed. The jury listened. The community watched. And outside the courtroom, the same question echoed again and again. Could this have been prevented? Was there a moment? A phone call, a conversation, a choice that could have changed everything? Or was this always going to end the way it did? When closing arguments arrived, the prosecution didn't shout. They didn't need to. They let the facts speak. They asked the jury to look beyond the word fear and see the reality beneath it. A man who chose violence. A man who decided who would live and who would die. A man who took control in the most irreversible way possible. And when the verdict finally came in June 2024, the room held its breath. Guilty. 2 counts of murder. No dramatic outburst. No visible relief. Just the quiet finality of accountability. But even then, the story didn't feel finished. Because verdicts don't answer more questions. They don't heal communities. They don't bring back the dead. Bethany and Ruth were gone. And what remained was a legacy shaped not by how they died, but by how they lived. A mother who spent her life caring for her child. A daughter who trusted the people closest to her. A community that refused to let them be forgotten. And a case that still forces us to ask something deeply uncomfortable. When fear enters the picture, who pays the price? And who decides? The silence that followed the verdict was heavy, not because justice hadn't been served, but because nothing could undo what had already been done. And that silence lingered, because some stories don't end with closure. They end with questions. And in this case, the questions refused to go away. Do you believe Reginald's explanation? Was fear the motive or the excuse? And what would you have done if you truly believed you were about to lose everything? And if this story made you think, made you feel, or made you question something you thought you understood, don't forget to like the video, follow the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Long after the courtroom emptied, psychologists kept circling back to the same uncomfortable truth. This wasn't a crime of impulse. It didn't explode out of nowhere. It formed quietly, slowly, in the space between fear and control. Experts who reviewed the case pointed out something chilling. Reginald McLaren didn't describe panic. He described anticipation. He talked about what might happen, about futures that hadn't arrived yet, about suffering that hadn't begun. Fear usually reacts to danger that's already at the door. This fear lived further down the road. And that distinction mattered. Because when fear is immediate, people run. They call for help. They scramble. But when fear is imagined, when it grows unchecked, it can turn into something else entirely. It can become justification. Reginald framed his actions as protection. Protection from homelessness. Protection from hardship. Protection from a world he believed would be cruel to his wife and daughter. But protection requires consent. And neither Bethany nor Ruth were given a choice. Bethany had survived 70 years of life. She had endured exhaustion, sacrifice, aging, and the relentless responsibility of caregiving. Nothing in her history suggested she would surrender to death without resistance. And Ruth, whose life depended on routine and trust, had no ability to consent to such a decision at all. That's where the psychology becomes impossible to ignore. Because the moment Reginald decided he knew what was best for them, he stopped seeing them as people. They became problems to solve. Outcomes to control. And control is often what desperation hides behind. Investigators noted that Reginald didn't seek counseling. He didn't reach out to disability services. He didn't ask for community help. He didn't even warn extended family. Instead, he internalized everything. And isolation has a way of amplifying fear until it feels absolute. Experts say that when someone believes they are the only one who understands the situation, they also begin to believe they are the only one capable of making decisions, even fatal ones. What haunts this case isn't just what Reginald did. It's what he didn't do. He didn't explore alternatives. He didn't ask for help. He didn't pause. And that absence, that silence, is where the real danger lived. Neighbors later said the family kept to themselves. Quiet. Private. Nothing outwardly alarming. Which raises another uncomfortable question. How many families are carrying unbearable pressure behind closed doors? Without anyone knowing, the vigil held for Bethany and Ruth drew people who had never met them. Candles flickered. Names were spoken aloud. Strangers cried for a mother and daughter they only knew through headlines. And in those moments, the story shifted. It stopped being about Reginald. It became about loss, about vulnerability, about the people who are most at risk when fear turns inward. Ruth's disabilities made her dependent. Bethany's age made her vulnerable. Together, they represented exactly who society claims to protect. And yet, they were the ones who paid the price. lives were lost inside a quiet apartment. And the rest of us are left to decide what we've learned from it. Do you believe Reginald truly thought he was protecting them? Or do you believe fear became an excuse for control? And if someone you loved was struggling in silence, would you notice before it was too late? If this story made you stop and think, take a moment to like the video. Follow the channel for more true crime stories told with care, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice keeps these conversations alive.